Good morning, everybody. My name's Jess Graves, and I'm the training specialist here at the Hampton VA Medical Center. And I am going to set up some refresher training videos. It's an interesting time that we have going on right now with a lot of distancing and inability to see each other in the same room. So we're working with what we got. So here we go. I have provided everybody with a medical support assistant training manual, which mostly focuses on the PowerPoints that we're going to be using when we are learning about scheduling. So that's what it looks like. I've hole punched everything for you so that you can put it into a binder. You can tab it. You can write all over it. Do whatever you want. It's yours. But the PowerPoints themselves that we're going to be using as we are doing this refresher training are all a part of this binder. So feel free to use it to refer back to. All of the information is updated and is customized to focus on Hampton specifically. And we're able to update it as rules change. So if anything in there ever changes or one of the million billion addendums are made and memos change directives, we can just update that part of the PowerPoint and send you the new page of the document. Okay, so just a disclaimer, this refresher training is not a punitive thing. It's not to say that nobody knows how to do their job. It's just making sure that everybody is on the same page. And things change all the time. So we like to make sure that we touch base every once in a while just to make sure that everybody is comfortable with the scheduling business rules and how we're supposed to be doing things. As always, if you need any help, you can always reach out to a supervisor, a subject matter expert, myself, and any of us would be happy to assist. So with that said, we're going to move on and get into the content. The first thing I'm going to be talking about for this video is going to be the scheduling directive 1230. So I'm going to go ahead and share my desktop here. Aha, there we are. So 1230, for those who might not know, is our scheduling directive. The scheduling directive tells us what the business rules are for how to schedule appointments and how to manage appointments after they're scheduled, cancellations, changes, etc. For consults, it's almost the same directive. It's Directive 1232. So 1230 focuses on regular appointments like return to clinic orders or patient-generated appointments, and then later we'll get into consults specifically. But the scheduling directive that we're talking about right this second is Directive 1230. If you ever hear anybody refer to 1230, that's what they're talking about, is our business rules for scheduling. So we're going to be talking about what our role is as it pertains to the scheduling directive. We're going to talk about directives themselves, and we're going to go through a whole bunch of terminology just so that we can be on our A game. I'm a personal believer that a lot of times MSAs know exactly what they're talking about and how to do their job. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, people know how to do their jobs. One of the things that can end up getting us a bad rap is that sometimes we have a hard time articulating. So you can show somebody how to do something all day long, but once they start throwing words at you that you don't use all the time, then you don't know what they're talking about, or because you don't use the right verbiage when someone asks you a question, they think that we're not familiar with the processes. So I like to focus a little bit on terminology as well. So obviously, medical support assistants are absolutely critical to us being successful at fulfilling our mission at the VA. We are most of the time, whether somebody calls or whether they're walking up to a desk, the first and last person that a patient or any internal customer is going to see when approaching a clinic or any other area, pretty much. So in that aspect, we really are the face of the VA. Now, when we have an interaction with another human being, we have an important decision to make. As the people who essentially hold the keys to the kingdom, we get to decide whether or not we are going to be facilitators or gatekeepers to world-class healthcare. All of us can probably think of a time that you've called an 800 number and you've depended on the person on the other end of the line for assistance. Whether that person decides to be helpful or not is going to make or break your experience with that company. We don't want to have anybody have to call back and talk to somebody else or have to come back up to the counter to speak to a different person to get the same kind of assistance. The service that we offer people should be reliable, right? And so it's really important to understand all the different ways that MSAs can be useful at the VA and all the different ways we offer our help and basically hold the facility down. So there are many different possible MSA assignments. The important part here that I want to illustrate is that the requirements of different areas can be vastly different from one another. So if you work in one place, you may use a certain software all the time that you would very rarely ever use in a different department. One of the ways that this can sometimes cause conflict is when MSAs transfer from one place to another. It's very easy to get overwhelmed and think, oh geez, this is going to take forever. I'm going to have to train this person how to do everything. They don't know anything about the way our clinics do things. But how many of us have learned a new skill or a new way of doing things from somebody who came from another department? And the only way that things improved is that we happen to have that conversation with that person. So maybe instead of focusing on how difficult it might be to teach someone everything that they need to know to be on your team, maybe we should think about what is this person bringing with them that might be able to enhance the way that we do business here. Okay. There are a lot of different software and practices and policies that MSAs are expected to be mastered at. There's so many different things that we are expected to know in and out. And I'm just going to take a moment and say thank you and be appreciative for everybody who does their best to learn all of this stuff. When I first presented this program, I passed this big training booklet to the providers at Morning Report, and they were completely astounded by the amount of material that we're expected to be mastered at in such a short time. A big portion of what MSAs do is scheduling, making appointments, consult management, pulling reports, changing appointments after they're made, like cancellations or rescheduling. We also handle patient-centered scheduling, which is our recall reminder, the process by which we send people postcards, and to a much, much lesser extent, our electronic wait list. The EWL is pretty much obsolete at this point, but because it still exists, I still have to train on it. So that will be a whole nother PowerPoint. Yay! We also use VetLink a lot, which is how we know when people are checking in, and the system that everybody should be using to update demographics, if possible. And I also want to point out that when it comes to working in a specific department, every department has different needs. They do things a little bit differently, okay? It's not always a matter of doing it right or doing it wrong. Scheduling directives and other policies that are put into place are often just a bare minimum. So if your department decides that it wants to enhance that somehow, there's nothing saying it can't. Okay? Just understand that there's a lot of very specific information that is departmentally specific that I don't go over in the videos, just because the best way for you to learn that sort of stuff is to get your hands on it. So it's not only a Veterans Health Administration policy, but it's a national policy that has been accepted as just good health care to provide patients with timely, high quality care. Now, in order to do that, we have to have a sound scheduling system, which is two different parts. Number one, it's software that works, which is tech responsibility, right? And then the other part is us having a standard practice. So everyone who's scheduling, following the same rules and doing things in the same way. Like I said before, it shouldn't depend on who you talk to, the kind of service that you're going to get. You should be offered the same sort of appointments and opportunities no matter who you get on the phone. So being able to offer people accurate, timely appointments is essential to being able to provide world-class service. We also have to comply with the Mission Act. It's federal law, so it goes without saying we have to abide by the regulations in the Mission Act. Again, that's a totally different PowerPoint, so I won't beat on the Mission Act too much right now. Just so you know, we do publicly report our wait times, and the VA was actually the first healthcare organization in the United States to publicly report their wait times, for better or for worse. At least we're transparent about it. Now, the wait times that are reported and that we keep track of are based on two different sort of parameters. We have wait time 1 and wait time 2. That's what they are lovingly called in VISTA. Wait time 1 essentially lets us know how far ahead people are able to make their appointments. So wait time 1 starts counting at the create date. The create date is the day that we realized that there was a need for an appointment. So either the day that an order was put in or a consult was entered, or the day that the patient called if it's a new request, like the patient calls and says, I have an earache, I need to see my doctor. The day they call, that's the create date. Okay. So wait time 1 counts in how many days has transpired in between that create date and the day that the appointment actually takes place. So it lets us know again just how far ahead of time are people able to make their appointments. Wait time 2 is the one that is a little bit more critical as far as determining whether or not people are getting appropriate service. Wait time 2 starts counting at the PID, which I'll get into ad nauseum in a little bit, but essentially the PID is the day that the patient's supposed to come back, as we know. Provider and the patient should have already agreed upon this date when they talked. So wait time 2 counts the number of days that it's transpired between the PID and the patient's actual appointment. So what this lets us know is how far beyond when the patient is supposed to come back are they actually being seen, otherwise known as how much of a delay are these patients having to deal with. So wait time 2 is usually the one that ends up getting talked about on news or, what have you. So the way we break it down when we measure these wait times, as far as the VA goes, is we break it down into 3 different sections. Wait times are measured from primary care, from mental health, and from specialty clinics. Okay. Additionally, patients are surveyed to find out, in their opinion, were they seen when they wanted to be seen? Now, is this something that we have any control over? Not totally, but indirectly we kind of do. It's been scientifically proven that if you use certain verbiage, that can affect survey results at a later time. So sometimes just using words like prefer or preference might skew or influence those survey results in our favor, should they actually decide to do the survey, which again we have no control over. But for example, you're making an appointment with somebody and you say, okay, Mr. Mickey Mouse, you and your doctor discussed you returning in 6 weeks. That is on this date. What's your preference? When do you prefer to come back? Now, we may or may not be able to offer them an appointment on that day, but should they decide to do the survey later, they may see a question that asks them, was your preference taken into account when you got your appointment? And they might remember us asking them, what do you prefer? And so then they can check the box that says, okay, yeah, they did ask me what my preference was. Wonderful. So keep that in mind when you're making appointments with patients, is that sometimes those words can make a big difference. Now, I'm not a fan of telling people that we have tools to use and not being able to tell them how to use them. So just so that you're aware, if we tell somebody that our wait times are measured and they want to know how to get to them, this is how. If the patient goes to www.accesstocare.va.gov, this page will show up that you're seeing, and they will look for the big button that says, how quickly can my VA facility see me? Now, when they double click on this button, they are brought to a page and they get to choose either same-day services or access times at individual facilities. So the button that says access times at individual facilities is the one that is going to show them the average for a routine appointment. And when they click on that, you essentially see a Google search. You enter your zip code, what radius that you want to look for facilities in, what type of appointment it is, and when you search for it, you get search results that show you the contact information for the clinic. You can click a link to get a map there, how far away it is, and what their average wait time is. Now, the wait times are calculated about every 30 days, and they are averages. You'd have to contact the clinic to see when their next actual available appointment is. Could be sooner or later. My tip for the wise is at least play around with this for a moment or two before you talk to somebody about it. That way you feel like you really know what you're talking about and you can discuss the tool with them with confidence. So moving on. Service connection is something that is talked about a lot, and it may not necessarily be clear to everybody exactly how service connection ties into appointments. We'll hear people sometimes say things like, oh, I'm 50% or 100% connected, or this is a service-connected condition, I should be seen right away. And those patients are not wrong, because according to federal law, we are mandated to provide priority care to people who are over 50% service-connected or people who have a service-connected disability. However, there are a few factors that are left out of this, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult to have this conversation with somebody who is stressed out. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background information on that just so you have a little bit of a handle on it. So yes, we are mandated to give these patients priority care. Here are a couple of more factors though. First, the priority scheduling of any service-connected veteran must not impact the appointment of anybody who is previously scheduled. So no appointments are getting bumped for someone because of their service connection. Okay. Secondly, emergent and urgent care trumps any kind of service connection issue. Okay? Emergent and urgent care, we're talking about life or limb, or potentially something communicable, something that needs attention toot sweet. So, according to the same law that says that we have to give service-connected veterans or service-connected disabilities priority appointments, that same law also says these two things, that we're not bumping anybody else's appointments and that ER and urgent care come first. Now, once you get into the ER, they don't really consider service connection there. They consider the acuity of whatever's going on, clearly. It's important that we use VISTA and VSE properly to make sure that this law is being complied with. So why does that bullet point even belong right here on this slide? Here's why. It might seem kind of daunting to think about how we go about giving somebody priority care. Do we have to go look into somebody's chart, figure out their service connection, look at their priority group? No, we don't have to do any of that. VISTA and VSE are automatically set up to prioritize patients according to priority group and according to service connection. So that's already done for us by the system. All we have to do is follow the list like we're supposed to. So that means no cherry picking out of the list. Start from the first person on the list and move to the bottom. You're following the law. Everything's gravy. Okay? The bottom bullet point is just talking about how we use the consult package to pull consults. And again, these patients are already listed by priority and by service connection. So all you have to do is start from the top and work your way to the bottom, and you're golden. Moving on into some terminology, you may or may not know that VISTA used to be absolutely everything for the VA. It was our charting system, it was our appointment manager, it was our payroll, it was our electronic work request, it was our email, it was absolutely everything. So this is important to know because most of the software that we use is in one way or another tied back to VISTA. Appointment management is the part of VISTA that our scheduling GUI, VSE, comes from. Essentially what happened was one day somebody said, you know what, VISTA's hard. We need a way to point and click instead of doing all these commands that we have to remember. Okay, so somebody made a GUI, a graphic user interface, which is point and click, and that's VSE. But appointment management is the part in VISTA that you go to schedule appointments. That's why when you're in VISTA, it's _AM for appointment management. Okay, people have to have certain training to have access to that. Not everybody has access to appointment management. You all do. The electronic wait list, there is another PowerPoint on. We'll go over ad nauseum later. Essentially, it is obsolete. However, because it still exists, we still have to train on it. So there you have it. What you need to remember as far as EWL is 90 days. Way back in the day, when we were using VISTA to schedule, the scheduling grids used to only go out for 90 days. So anybody that needed an appointment further out than 3 months had to be put on a list because we didn't have the ability to schedule them anywhere. And that's where EWL came from. So just remember 90 days. The EWL was meant for either new patients waiting 90 or more days or established patients who can't be seen within 90 days or a new problem. Okay. Patient-centered scheduling is what we used to call recall. And what that is not an appointment, but it is a process by which the system kicks out a postcard to tell somebody, hey, you need to call in and make an appointment. Generally, this is only used when people decline to schedule an appointment for some reason. They don't want to make an appointment right now. They want us to remind them to make an appointment. And that's how we do it. There's a whole nother lesson on that, so I won't talk about it too much. Just remember it's now called patient-centered scheduling instead of recall, and that it's not an actual appointment, it's just a postcard. Okay? So, back to the PID. The patient indicated date has so many names, it's not even funny. Now, we define the PID as the patient/provider indicated date. The reason why is because the patient and provider should be having this conversation. When the patient has an appointment, they should be having a discussion about the plan going forward with their provider, and the provider should be telling them, this is when I want you to come back. And so in theory, most people would not have an issue with their PID, right? Sometimes it happens. But that's why we call it the patient-provider indicated date, excuse me, because it's something that they were supposed to have agreed upon already. If the patient calls and it is the patient's request, there's no order or anything, then clearly it is the patient indicated date. And this date is the day that they have decided that the patient should be coming back. That's the PID. Some facilities routinely differentiate between an EPID and IPID, so an external PID and internal PID. We don't really use that at Hampton, but it still exists. So if anybody should happen to say EPID or external or internal, you know what they mean. Basically, the only time it's external is when the patient calls in the absence of an order and says, I want an appointment. That's an external PID. Everything else is internal. Regardless of whether the PID is external or internal, all business rules remain the same, so appointments are scheduled the same way. No changes, okay? Consults currently have a field in them that says CID, or clinically indicated date, which is what the PID used to be called. And Vista has a field that says CID/patient preferred date, because the patient preferred date was another name. So it used to be called clinically indicated date, preferred date, patient indicated date, desired date. All of those names, they're the same thing as PID, okay? Whatever date the appointment is supposed to happen is the PID, all right? And the last term we have on this slide is blind scheduling, which we all know at this point is a complete and utter no-no. At no point do we ever make an appointment without the patient's input and blessing. For one thing, it's rude, it's bad business practice, and for another thing, somebody's probably really not likely to show up to their appointment if they don't know about it. So there's that. So we don't blind schedule. It is prohibited without question. An RTC is a return to clinic order. We know that. The return to clinic order has a PID on it that we use when we go to schedule. There is another lesson entirely for time-sensitive appointments, so I'm not going to beat that up too much. Just know that a time-sensitive appointment, we call them no later thans, used to be called a priority appointment. And the thing that you should remember about them is that for time-sensitive appointments, the PID is the absolute last day that the patient can be seen. So PIDs, or time-sensitive appointments, have to be scheduled no later than the PID, on or before, okay? And there is an entirely separate set of reports that is run by the front office that lets them know if there are time-sensitive appointments that are not being seen by their PID. When appointments are canceled by clinic, that means the clinic generated the cancellation, which is anything short of the patient saying that they're not coming in. So if the clinic's canceled because a doctor called out, or because we don't have enough staff, or because the patient was admitted, or because the consult was canceled because the patient doesn't need that particular procedure, if it's bad weather, anything like that, those are all canceled by clinic. Why does it matter, really? Well, aside from keeping accurate data, the PID going forward depends on whether or not the clinic or the patient canceled. So whenever the clinic cancels, with one exception, whenever the clinic cancels, the PID that is used when the patient reschedules is the original PID. So for clinic cancellations, you use the original PID except for one instance. And that instance is when we offer an earlier appointment and the patient accepts it. That used to, a couple of years ago, be different. So in case you hear anybody who's been here for a while say that, that's a patient cancellation. It's not anymore. The directive has changed to say that when we offer the patient an earlier appointment and they accept it, it is now a clinic cancellation, and that is the only time that the clinic cancels where the PID changes. All right? Now, when you cancel in Vista, you're going to have to enter some preset reasons for cancellation, which are listed here on this slide. Vista doesn't let you free type in this section. The great news, though, is that if you forget what the commands are, you can either look back at this PowerPoint in your workbook, or you can enter a couple of question marks in Vista, and it will give you the list of everything that you have an option to choose from. When an appointment is canceled by patient, that means that the patient has said, I'm not coming in. That's the only time that we cancel by patient. Okay? Is when the patient generates that cancellation. Now, in an instance like that, the PID changes. So when you reschedule, the new PID is whatever date they tell you that they would like to reschedule for. A new patient appointment is scheduled for someone who has either, number one, never been seen by the VA, so they're brand spanking new, or they have not been seen in 24 months. After 2 years, patients who were currently established are listed again as new patients. So we need to be cognizant of that when we're rescheduling people, particularly if they've been rescheduled more than once, because depending on how long they're waiting, they could be thrown back into that new patient status, and then they have to have an hour appointment instead of 30 minutes, and certain processes change for them. So while it is not solely our responsibility as MSAs to keep track of all of that, if you should happen to be scheduling someone or a clinic gets canceled and you need to see about rescheduling, and you notice that the last time this patient was seen was almost 2 years ago, and our next available appointment is going to put them into that new patient status, that would be a great time to reach out to the provider and just say, hey, is there any way we might be able to accommodate this person earlier? That way they're not listed as a new patient, right? An established patient is somebody who has been seen within 2 years, okay? Now, late arrivals and no-shows are kind of a hot button topic, right? Some clinics know exactly what the rules are and follow 1230 and everything is perfect and harmonious. Some clinics, there is a little bit of extra conversation regarding these topics, so I'm going to go ahead and clear it up for you. Per 1230, there is no such thing as a grace period. There's no 15, 20 minutes listed in 1230 where we can call patients a no-show after that point in time. If they arrive before the end of the business day, they are late. They're not a no-show, okay? One of the reasons why I left the verbiage the way I did on this PowerPoint is to demonstrate that I understand that sometimes the information that's given to you can be a little bit confusing. For example, no-shows here on this PowerPoint are defined as when a patient doesn't present for their scheduled appointment by the appointment start time. Technically, that isn't true. A no-show is when a patient doesn't show before the end of the business day, according to the directive. Okay, so write that down if you're taking notes. If the patient shows up anytime before the end of the business day, they are not a no-show. Providers don't get to dictate who's a no-show. MSAs don't get to dictate who's a no-show. 1230 dictates who's a no-show. And no-shows are anybody who had an appointment that day and did not show up before the end of the business day. If they show up 5 hours late, they're late. They're not a no-show. If they call 5 hours later to cancel, they're a cancellation. They're not a no-show. Okay. Feel free to reach out to myself or anybody in HAS leadership or an HAS supervisor to clarify that if you have further questions about that. So this next slide talks about some information that may or may not be pertinent to you as a scheduler. However, if anybody has designs to become an AO later, then it's definitely worth knowing. And this part helps us kind of understand why some of the reports that we're going to talk about later are important. So I'm going to start with talking about encounters. Encounters are defined as a professional contact between a patient and a provider who has responsibility for diagnosing, evaluating, and treating a patient's condition. Okay. What does this mean for us? Well, this means that an encounter is when the doctor goes into the system and enters the little codes about what procedures they did and the actual reason for the appointment. That information will tell the system two things. An encounter is defined as a professional contact between a patient and a provider with responsibility for diagnosing, evaluating, and treating the patient's condition. Why does that matter to us? Well, because we have to do some of the reports, basically, that let us know when encounters are not completed. Why does it matter to everybody? Because encounters are where doctors will document not only the reason for the visit, but what action they took with the patient. Now, the codes that they enter when they do these encounters not only tell the facility the dollar amount of the work that's been done so that we can speak about what we're doing for patients in terms of how much it's worth in dollars, but it's also related to increments of time. So it's related to workload in terms of time, which may not really matter to us schedulers, but again, the data that we pull helps us as a facility be able to request more resources and things like that. Okay. So in other places, in other facilities, an encounter can be known as a charge. So when the doctors or providers go to enter their charges. Okay. So a count clinic is a clinic that has workload. Basically, it's a clinic that the scheduled patients have charges associated with their appointment versus a non-count clinic, which is a clinic that is really only established for us as a placeholder so we can keep track of people who have been seen somewhere, but they are not necessarily having any kind of procedure done. So an example for that would be like our new patient orientation. There's a non-count clinic built for that so that we can keep track of who showed up to NPO, but nobody's going to go in there and do an encounter and assess any charges for those patients. So non-count clinics are pretty much used for internal use. An occasion of service is an instance where a patient might have something technical or administrative done for them, but there's no contact with someone who is responsible for diagnosing and treating any condition. So an example of that would be like maybe a diagnostic test or lab work where, yes, someone is having something done, but they're not seeing a doctor who's going to give them answers today or make any suggestions. Okay, it used to be known as an ancillary service. I'm pretty sure we know the difference between emergent and urgent care, right? Urgent care is I got stung by a bee. Emergent care is a beehive fell on my head. Okay, emergent care is life or limb. Okay, urgent care is acute, but not life or limb. A service-connected veteran is a veteran who has an illness or injury that was either incurred in or aggravated by their military service as adjudicated by the Veterans Benefits Administration. Sorry. So what that means is a condition is not service connected just because somebody feels like it is. It has to be decided by benefits and documented for it to be a bona fide service connected condition. Non-service connected veterans still might be able to be seen at the VA. They just don't have any conditions that are documented and adjudicated by VBA as being incurred in or aggravated by their service time. Now, when it comes to scheduling for veterans, we want to be sure of a few different practices that we're using. First, we want to make sure that we ask the veteran what date they want to be seen. We want to make sure that we are seeking veteran feedback early and often. So what does that look like? When they come to the checkout desk, it may be saying, all right, Mr. Mickey Mouse, your doctor and you had discussed returning in 6 weeks. That's around this date. What's your preference? When do you prefer to be seen? Okay. Seeking early and often would be, okay, the veteran gives you a date and maybe you don't have that and they look like they might be a little bit unhappy with an appointment that you've suggested, and you just take the extra step to say, are you sure? Does that work for you? I can look for a different day, just so that they're aware that we are in this and present with them and that what they want really matters to us. And we want to be proactive as well. So if you happen to be looking at somebody's chart and noticing that they have other appointments scheduled on a certain day, you can say, I noticed that you have appointments scheduled on this day. Would you like to coordinate this new appointment with those, or is that too much for you on one day? So that's being proactive. We want to make sure that our veterans are engaged in this decision making. It should not be transactional, just like this is the day I have, take it or leave it. No, this is why we seek what the veterans want early and we ask them to tell us when they want to be seen instead of just throwing a date at them and they can either digest it or spit it out, right? And we want to make sure that we're offering high quality health care that is consistent. Again, I can't say it enough. Veterans should not have to go to a particular person to get good service. They should be able to count on that from anybody. Special attention to the needs of population groups, including Operation Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, Operation New Dawn, and women's veterans. Essentially what this means is that we should be aware that there are clinics that specifically cater to and are trained in taking care of those particular kinds of veterans. So we should be offering them, if it falls into the scope of what we're doing, a women's clinic visit if they are a woman, or transition care management for people who are transferring. For many of us, all of that's already going to be taken care of by the time they get to us, but just keep in mind there are special groups for people who fall within certain categories of veteran. This is probably a good time to mention as far as transgender veterans go. Federal law says that regardless of the appearance of a veteran, if a veteran identifies as a woman, they have a right to request to be seen in the women's clinic. This person could show up looking like ZZ Top and Duck Dynasty. If they say, I identify as a woman, that means that they have the right to be seen in the women's clinic. It's not our job to ask for any kind of proof of anything. They don't have to be post-op, okay? They have the right. And if we don't accommodate that right, then we're being discriminatory. So just keep that in mind. And if you have any questions about our LGBT program, we have some absolutely great resources. You can reach out to myself or Dr. Tiffany Lang Altman, Langealtman, and she's the LGBT coordinator for the facility, and she would be absolutely thrilled to assist you. So how do our scheduling business rules work? What are the rules? Well, generally, the rules are that we schedule appointments immediately if possible, but no later than 3 calendar days after the request. So if an order is put in, we try to schedule that as soon as possible. Does it always happen? Do RTCs sometimes sit on a list and we don't get to them for several days because we're just that backed up? Absolutely. But the goal is we're supposed to try to reach out to people within 3 calendar days after the order is entered. We should also be validating and updating demographics at each patient interaction or each appointment. Okay, so every time they come in, we should be trying to review their address, their phone number, next of kin, ask them if their insurance has changed, because if something happens, we don't want to have the wrong information on file for a patient. And another part of the scheduling business rules is to make appointments based on the PID. That's a part of the directive. That is pretty self-explanatory. Try to make appointments on the day that we want the patient to come in. Okay. PIDs have to be entered in the order template by the provider. They do not have the option to submit an order without a PID. The only exception being if they should enter a text order, which is still technically possible. There is a place in CPRS that you can go and enter a text order where you can basically free type what you want. We are able to schedule text orders if they have all of the necessary information for us to schedule. So PID, the clinic name, the length of the appointment, right? If they don't have these things in them, then we don't have enough information to schedule. Most of the time that's not an issue because most doctors don't bother using the text orders anymore because using our order template is just easier. So the PID is in the order. They are not able to enter date ranges. So a provider can put come back in 6 weeks, but they cannot put come back in August. So date ranges are not acceptable. When we make appointments at checkout, it used to be that we would complete an RTC by going into CPRS and clicking a few buttons to make that happen. If you're using VSE, the scheduling GUI, you don't have to do that. The return to clinic orders are automatically completed when we schedule the appointment, which is another reason why using VSE is advisable. However, if that portion of VSE should break, or if you are scheduling in Vista for some reason, then you would need to go into CPRS and complete the order, and I'll show you how to do that. Another part of Directive 1230, our scheduling business rules, is unless the provider says otherwise, we should try to schedule them within 30 days of the PID. Now, I know a lot of people are probably at this point saying, wait, Mission Act. Remember, 1230 was released years and years before the Mission Act ever came out. Okay? So this was the original scheduling business rule. And if the patient is not Mission Act eligible for some reason, then we revert back to the old scheduling business rules, which means we're back to trying to schedule people within 30 days of that PID. Okay? So this is just what the original business rule says. 1230 also says that the providers have to enter the PID into CPRS. No date ranges, we just went over that. And that schedulers have to use the PID. that is documented on the order when we make the appointment. So what happens if a veteran says, oh, I know that I literally just talked about this with the doctor when I was in the room, but as I was walking up here, I just remembered I'm going to Costa Rica for 6 months and I'm not going to be back. So I'm not going to be able to make that appointment. If that happens, any appointments that veterans want that are over 30 days past the PID, we need to go back to the provider about and check and make sure that it is medically safe for that to happen, and also that if the patient has any medications, that we have them set up to receive those. Okay. There is not a rule against scheduling that far out. We just have to check those things. So here's the Mission Act part. If the VA can't offer an appointment within an acceptable time frame as defined by the Mission Act, then we have to offer the patient community care. We have to ask the patient if they are wait time eligible. We have to ask them what their preference is, and we have to document it. By law, we must notify a patient if they are eligible for community care. We are not in compliance with federal law if someone is eligible and we don't tell them. So if someone is eligible, again, for Mission Act care, we have to tell them, we have to get their decision on whether or not they want to be seen with us or in the community, and we have to document it in CPRS and in VSE. Remember that everybody can see CPRS. There are a lot of people who can't see VSE. So therefore, it is also part of the directive that whatever documentation we do in VSE has to also be documented in CPRS as a note. So going back to the Mission Act, what's an acceptable time frame? Well, for primary care and mental health, the acceptable time frame is within 20 days of the create date, not the PID, the create date, the day the order was entered or the date the patient called. So 20 days from that day for primary care and mental health, and 28 days for mental health. Okay, and it's also 28 days from the create date, not from the PID. Clock starts ticking at the create date for Mission Act. Okay, and if the patient chooses community care, then we go ahead and we forward the consult to community care. Directive 1230 says that schedulers have to correctly transcribe the PID from the order to the appointment. VSE does this for us automatically. We don't have to type it in. If you're making an appointment in Vista, you have to make sure that you properly enter the PID. Okay? If you don't do that and you're audited, it will be incorrect. The part about scheduling inpatient appointments or scheduling clinic appointments that are requested through inpatient discharge, scheduling clinic appointments requested through an inpatient discharge event according to the provider's CPRS order entry. What this means is that when a patient is admitted to the hospital, there are discharge instructions, and that patient has to be seen within 7 days of their discharge by their primary care provider. The discharge instructions are going to include them following up with their primary care provider, and whatever date that is entered in those discharge instructions is going to be the PID. 1230 also says that walk-in appointments should be scheduled as unscheduled appointments, or in VSE they're listed as create a walk-in appointment. Another rule of 1230 says that if a provider gives you specific instructions when they enter an order on how to schedule a patient, we have to follow those instructions exactly. So if a provider enters an order and says, schedule this patient on April 5th at 10 a.m. in X clinic, then that's what we have to do. And you have to overbook if necessary. You don't have to ask the doctor at that point if you can overbook, because 1230 says that that's what has to be done if specific instructions are given. Now, as a professional courtesy, you may want to go back to the provider and say, hey, did you know you already had somebody scheduled in that block? But per the scheduling business rules, you have permission to do it. Another requirement of Directive 1230 is that we only enter cancel by patient when the patient actually originates the cancellation. So what that means is, short of a patient calling and saying, I'm not coming to my appointment, everything should be canceled by clinic. Appointments are only canceled by patient when the patient calls in and says, I'm not coming to this appointment. Okay? And just like when you cancel an appointment by clinic, you'll have to pick a more specific reason why the appointment was canceled. And you both have preset options that you can choose from, and the system will additionally allow you to free type in answers at a later time. All appointments are to be scheduled with patient input. No blind scheduling is permitted. I know we've been over it ad nauseum, but it bears repeating. It's very important. So we do not blind schedule appointments. When we're attempting to get in touch with patients to schedule appointments over the phone, the minimum scheduling efforts, is what they're called, are 2 contact attempts for most clinics. And the 2 contact attempts can consist of a phone call and a letter. Now, technically, the contacts are considered to be on different days. You can make the phone call and mail the letter on the same day, because the patient is not going to receive the letter on the same day that you mailed it. So that still counts as 2 separate days. And sending the letter out immediately after you're not able to reach a patient prevents rework from being done. Those of us who worry about our carbon footprint feel some kind of way about going ahead and sending a letter out through the mailroom just in case the patient calls back. We don't want to waste that paper, but I do understand the purpose of it, and it's worth not having to go back and do all this rework when we have so many patients waiting. For mental health, the minimum scheduling efforts are 3 phone calls and a letter, so 4 patient contacts. Okay. The system does include a bad address indicator to let us know if the post office has kicked back mail from somebody's house. If you happen to notice that while you're scheduling, please, please, please try to get a correct address from the patient. Explain to them how important it is, because we mail all of our medications and they won't get their appointment notifications if we don't have the proper address, etc. So 1230 says that after 2 weeks pass, so 14 days after we mail a letter, we are able to disposition the request for an appointment. The only exception to that is if the provider happens to put a note on the order that says that additional scheduling efforts may be required. If that's the case, then you have to double check with the provider before you can disposition anything. But otherwise, we do not have to ask for provider permission. We are able to disposition requests after that 2-week mark has passed. If you send a letter and then you, for whatever reason, decide, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and try to give them another phone call, that phone call does not start the clock again. The scheduling directive says that requests are dispositioned 14 days after the letter is sent. So the letter is what determines when that 14-day count starts. And of course, anytime we make any sort of change to an appointment, or anytime we really access a patient's record for any reason, we're supposed to be putting some documentation in there as far as why we're accessing the record, what changes we're making, and why. So that's really important. A lot of times you might be frustrated going into a patient's record and they've called for something and you can't help them because there's 0 documentation in the system as far as what happened before. So don't be one of those people. put in the documentation as far as why you're in the chart. It also covers you for HIPAA purposes. If there's ever an investigation that's done as far as why people are accessing this person's information, then you put documentation in there as to why. So when you cancel, that's no different. You put notes in there as well. Okay. This slide refers to an old practice that we had before VSE came along. VSE is really and truly dynamic in that it allows us to look at all kinds of schedules in real time. With Vista, when that was all we had, essentially what we did was printed out the clinic grid every day to show us the foreseeable future and what our clinics looked like. That way, when we participated in huddles and things like that, we could look at the doctor and say, this is what your clinic's looking like for the next few weeks. And that way we knew if there were any holes that we could try to offer earlier appointments, if we had any wiggle room for walk-ins, or anything really. And this guidance just refers to looking for those openings because we're so busy, right? That we just have all these openings all over the place to be able to offer to people. But if it ever happened, we were supposed to use a scheduling grid to look at the different openings and offer those to patients that were on the EWL or patients that tried to call for a same-day appointment or what have you. Same-day consults should be scheduled as unscheduled appointments. It is technically possible to just make an appointment and make the PID today. But when you don't mark it as an unscheduled appointment, when we pull the data for walk-ins or for unscheduled appointments are the same thing, then the appointments that are not marked as such don't show up. So it skews our data. And like we've been over before, whenever data is skewed, it is very rarely in our favor. Sorry about that. Okay, so where was I? So walk-in appointments or unscheduled appointments are to be scheduled as such. It is technically possible to make an appointment for today and just put the PID as today. The problem with that is that when we pull our data, those appointments that are not marked as unscheduled are not going to be recognized. So like we talked about before, anytime the data is skewed, it's very rarely in our favor. So we want to make sure that we're scheduling appointments appropriately. And if they're not scheduled, meaning the appointment was not made before today, they're just coming in now, that's an unscheduled visit. And we want to make sure that we indicate that. A lot of times when I do trainings like this, I will be asked to make a separate slide with different commands, like a tutorial that people can just look up. So that's what I've done here. In Vista, under the appointment management section, this is a list of the different commands that you can use. And we'll go further into that in our next video when we get into Welcome to Vista. But this is in response to people who asked for a separate slide with that information on it. So just a quick knowledge check. The definition of PID is the patient/provider indicated date. Again, patient/provider indicated date. When is it used? Quite simply, when we schedule appointments. That's when it's used. We find PIDs either in the return to clinic order, the consult, or the patient gives us the PID if the appointment is patient generated. Who provides it? Again, the patient provides it if they're the one who calls. The doctor provides it when it is an internal PID, so it's a provider who's entering an order or a consult. Time-sensitive appointments, where are they documented? Time-sensitive appointments are documented on the order. So, it's been real. I will see you around. Thank you.